Hey bag ladies and bag dudes, I'm Sarah Lawson from Sew Sweetness. Come sew along with me as I show you how to make my Clydebank tote sewing pattern. The Clydebank tote requires no purse hardware and it's available in sizes small and also size large. So grab your supplies and let's get started. Okay, before we begin, you'll need to print out the PDF pattern file, and you always want to print the file using Adobe Reader, and you'll need to be printing at actual size. So not scaling or fit to page, it needs to be printed at actual size. So the last 8 pages of the PDF file are the templates. Pages 1 through 4 will be for size large, and page 5 through 8 will be for size small. So you only need to print out the group of pages for the size that you're making. So if you're making size large, you'll notice that on page 4 of the templates, there's a 1-inch square and a 4-centimeter square. You'll want to measure either of those squares to make sure that they measure exactly either 1 inch or 4 centimeters. So that square should not be slightly smaller or slightly larger. It needs to be exact. I'm going to be making size small for this demonstration. The instructions for both bags are the same unless otherwise noted. So let me show you how to tape these pages together. Again, you'll notice for size small on page 5, there's also that 1-inch square and the 4-centimeter square. So we're going to be taping these pages together in a line, and the same goes for if you're making size large. So I'm going to go ahead and take pages 5 and 6. I'm going to cut out the left-hand margin on page 6. And then if you'll notice, there's a black triangle on both pages, and that's to help you connect the pages so that they're aligned. So I'm going to go ahead and align those 2 black triangles. You'll also be lining up the border rectangle around the pages, and you'll also want to check and just make sure that the artwork forms a continuous line. So I'm going to take some tape and tape those 2 pages together. And then let's go ahead and add page 7. Again, we'll be cutting out along the left-hand margin. And then same thing, align those triangles and tape the pages together. And then finally the last remaining page, again cutting out that left-hand margin. Okay, so whether you're making size large or size small, you'll have 2 templates to cut out. And you'll be cutting out these templates along the outside of the thick black line. So let me just go ahead and show you just to get started. And you'll continue cutting out both pieces in the same manner, and you'll end up with 2 pieces, one for the side panel and one for the main panel, and this is what they'll look like. Okay, you'll be using those 2 pattern pieces as well as the cutting instructions to cut out all of your fabric and interfacing. All right, so let me show you how to attach the fabric to the interfacing. I'm going to start off with the exterior bottom panel. So there's a piece of Peltex interfacing which is optional but just gives the bottom of your bag some extra stability, especially if you'll be putting a lot of heavy items inside. So again, the Peltex is optional. You can also use a piece of Decoville Heavy instead. So if you are using the Peltex, you'll notice that it's cut smaller than the foam bottom panel. So you'll be centering the Peltex with the fusible side against the foam. And then I'm just going to take my iron and fuse that in place. I usually recommend using a pressing cloth for attaching fusible interfacing. In my videos, I don't use a pressing cloth just so that you can see exactly what I'm doing. And you want to make sure that the interfacing is properly adhered. So to do that, you can just take your fingernail and try to peel back a corner of the interfacing. If it seems firmly attached, then you're good to go. And if it peels back easily, then that just means you need to iron it a bit longer. Okay, so whether you're using the Peltex or not, go ahead and lay your exterior bottom panel against the foam interfacing. And I'm going to use some Wonder Clips to hold that in place. And I'm going to be taking this over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to machine base the outer edge of the fabric using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm also going to lengthen my stitch length. Okay, you repeat that same process for the other pieces and their respective foam pieces that you cut out, and I'll also show you how to attach the shape flex interfacing. So this is the lining bottom panel. I'm going to flip my fabric so that it's wrong side facing up, and also the side of the shape flex that feels bumpy to your fingertips is the side with the adhesive, and that's the side that's going to go against the wrong side of your fabric. Okay, so again, I'm going to fuse this in place. And I have my iron set at the cotton setting, and you'll just want to keep your iron moving every few seconds. And you can also use a bit of steam if you prefer. Okay, and again, you just want to do a check to make sure that your interfacing is properly adhered. And then you'll repeat the same process for all of the pieces that require the shape flex interfacing. Okay, go ahead and pull out one of your zipper pocket pieces and go ahead and flip the fabric so that the wrong side is facing up. So when I'm marking lines for my zipper pockets, I always like to draw a little T at the top, just so I don't get mixed up in case I need to draw lines and move my fabric sideways, so I always know where that top edge is. Okay, so go ahead and take your ruler, and I'm going to be measuring 7.5 inches down from the top edge, and just go ahead and draw that line straight across. Okay, I'm going to draw a second horizontal line that's a 1/2 inch below the first line. And then I'm also going to draw a line that's 1 inch in from both of the side edges. Okay, now go ahead and pull out one of your lining main panels. Place it right side facing up, and go ahead and place the zipper pocket fabric directly on top. So you'll still see the wrong side of the fabric and your markings. And this is in step 6 of the pattern. So if you're making size small, the bottom edge of your zipper pocket will be 1/2 inch up from the bottom edge of the lining main panel. And if you're making size large, instead it will be 3 inches up from the bottom of your lining main panel. And again, that information is in step 6 of the pattern. So I'm making size small. So I'm going to be measuring a 1/2 inch up from the bottom of the lining main panel. And you can either finger press both of your fabrics in half and align the center crease, or you can just go ahead and measure in from the side edge. You want to make sure that that zipper pocket fabric is centered. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and place a couple of pins just to hold the layers of fabric in place. And then I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and stitch directly on top of the lines that I drew to form a rectangular box. And if you had your stitch length lengthened to 4 millimeters for the basting of the fabric to the foam, make sure you switch it back to your normal stitch length. And on my machine, my normal stitch length is 2.5 millimeters. And I also wanted to mention, depending on where you come down with your needle in the corner, you might need to add an extra stitch to get you directly into the corner where the two lines intersect. I recommend decreasing your stitch length to either 1 millimeter or 1.5 millimeters, and that will allow you to come down directly on top of the corner of both of those lines, and then you can change back to your normal stitch length. And this just helps you land right directly on the corners. Okay, I'm going to draw a horizontal line that's halfway up the box, so that will be 1/4 of an inch up, and the line will stop 1/4 of an inch away from either end. Okay, so where that line stops, I'm going to draw an outward facing V. Okay, now go ahead and grab your seam ripper. And I'm going to use my seam ripper to get an opening started. I'm going to cut directly on top of the line through both layers of fabric. And then after you make a small slit, then you can use your scissors for cutting the rest. Okay, so you're going to go ahead and cut, and then when you cut into the V's, cut as far into the corners as you can without cutting the stitches. The farther into the corners that you can cut without cutting the stitches, and the nicer the opening for your zipper pocket will look. Okay, so go ahead and take those zipper pocket fabrics and push them through the opening. Okay, I'm going to pull my iron back over, and I'm going to use my fingers to roll out the seam so that the fabrics are wrong sides together. Okay, make sure that pocket is nice and smooth underneath, and then go ahead and take your iron and press that opening so that it looks nice and crisp. So when it comes to ironing the side edges, if your fabrics look all bunched up, that just means you didn't cut far enough into the V's. So if that's the case, go ahead and pull the zipper pocket fabric back through the opening, recut your V's a little bit further, and then push the fabrics back through the opening and try to press it again. Okay, so go ahead and pull out one of your 12-inch zippers. And my favorite method for inserting zippers into a zipper pocket like this is to use Dritz Wash Away Wonder Tape. So basically, Dritz Wash Away Wonder Tape is 1/4 of an inch wide tape. It's double-sided tape, and the nice thing about this is you can stick it to your zipper and place it against your fabric rather than using pins, because sometimes using pins, when pinning the zipper to the fabric, tend to look a bit wavy. And if your zipper looks wavy when it's pinned, then it'll also look wavy when you've sewn it in place. So I'm going to go ahead and stick that Dritz Wash Away Wonder Tape to the very top edge of the zipper, and also the same thing for the bottom. Stick it down against the very bottom edge of the zipper and use your fingers to kind of press it in place. And then I'm just going to use my fingernail to peel back the paper and reveal the second side of the adhesive. Okay, so as you'll notice, I only used the Dritz Wash Away Wonder Tape where I needed it for the opening. I'm going to go ahead and place the zipper right side facing up underneath that little window opening in my lining. And you want to make sure that you have equal amounts of the zipper tape showing on top and bottom. You don't want your fabric pushed really tight up against your zipper teeth, because then you'll have a little bit of trouble getting your zipper zipped and unzipped. Okay, so also I wanted to mention about the Dritz Wash Away Wonder Tape. It is water soluble. So after you finished your project, if you happen to see a little bit of the adhesive showing, You can just spritz it with a water bottle, a spray bottle, rub it with your fingernail, and that adhesive will disappear. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and leave that zipper head off the edge of my fabric for now. We'll be sewing 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric, so I'm going to start about here, work my way around the rectangle. When I reach approximately here, I'm going to stop with the needle down, lift the presser foot up, zip that head past my foot, and then finish the rest of the rectangle. And I'm just going to use my fingers to pinch the zipper teeth together as I go over that side edge. Okay, flip to the wrong side of the fabric, and we're going to trim the zipper to within 1/4 of an inch of the stitching line. That just helps keep that zipper out of the seam allowance when we go to finish up the pocket. Okay, so I'm going to flip the top edge of the zipper pocket down so that it meets the bottom edge. And we're going to be sewing the 3 raw edges using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, except we're not going to be sewing through the lining main panel at all. So when it comes to sewing those top corners, just go ahead and push the lining main panel out of the way. Okay, and we're going to be sewing up this zipper pocket using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, and you'll repeat that same process with the second zipper pocket piece and the remaining lining main panel. The only difference is when you go to close up the zipper pocket, you're only going to sew about 1 inch in from the corners. We need to leave an opening because this is how we're going to turn the bag right side out when the bag is all finished. Okay, go ahead and take out your exterior main panel and one of your exterior side panels. So I'm going to go ahead and flip this so that the fabrics are right sides facing. Align the side edges, and I'm also going to take my ruler and measure 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom edge because we're not going to sew the entire side edge. We're going to stop sewing where that 1/4 of an inch mark is. So I'm going to go ahead and take my Wonder Clips and pin everything in place. And we're going to be sewing this pinned edge using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and again, make sure that you stop sewing when you reach that marking. Okay, go ahead and press that seam open. Okay, and then we're going to add the second exterior side panel. Again, fabrics will be right side facing. Line up the side edges. And again, I'm going to make a marking that's 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom of the exterior side panel. Okay, again, I'm going to use Wonder Clips to hold the layers in place. And I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and sew using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and again, you won't sew past that 1/4 of an inch marking. Okay, now go ahead and press that second seam open as well. Okay, and now we're going to attach the remaining exterior main panel. So we'll attach it to one side panel at a time, again, right sides together. We're going to line the side edges and pin in place, and also just as before, I'm going to go ahead and make a marking a 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom edge. Okay, and as before, we're going to sew this pinned edge using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, press that seam open. And then we're going to attach the remaining side of the exterior side panel. Okay, same as before. You're going to use your ruler to make a marking that's a 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom. And we're going to sew this pinned edge using a 1/4 of an inch seam. Okay, go ahead and press that final seam open on the end of your ironing board and go ahead and set your exterior to the side for now. Pull out one of your lining main panels and one of the lining side panels. And we're going to complete this process very similar to what we just did with the exterior. So again, flip the fabric so that they're right sides facing. We're going to use Wonder Clips to pin that side edge in place. Same as before, make a marking on the bottom of the lining side panel that's a 1/4 of an inch away from the bottom edge. We're going to start sewing using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. However, we're going to start veering toward a 1/2 inch seam allowance toward the center of the panel, and then you're going to veer back down to a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance by the time you hit that marking. So the purpose of increasing the seam allowance in the center of the panel is so that the lining fits more snugly inside the exterior when the bag is finished. Okay, now go ahead and add the remaining lining side panel, right sides together. And same process as when we sewed the first side panel in place. We're going to start with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, veer in toward a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then back down toward a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance when we reach the marking at the bottom of the panel. Okay, now let's add the remaining lining main panel. Again, sewn right sides together. I'm going to make the marking at the bottom edge, again 1/4 inch up. And then we'll be sewing starting with 1/4 inch seam allowance, varying toward 1/2, and then back down toward 1/4. Okay, now let's connect the remaining edge of the lining. Okay, right sides together. Make your marking 1/4 inch up from the bottom edge. And then we're going to start with 1/4 inch, veer toward 1/2 inch, and then back toward 1/4. Okay, go ahead and take out one of your zipper panels, and I'm going to use my ruler to make a marking that's 1/2 inch in from either end. Okay, pull out your long zipper. And I'm actually working with a zipper roll. So if you're working with a zipper roll, let me first show you how we need to secure just the front end of the zipper, which means the area where the zipper head is when the zipper will be closed. So because I'm working with a zipper roll, I have a cut edge here, so I need to finish that edge. I have one side already completed. As you can see, I folded my zipper tape up according to a 45-degree angle, and I just tacked it down with some stitches just to hold that edge in place. Let me show you with this side what that looks like. Okay, so I'm just folding that zipper tape down again so that it makes a 45-degree angle, and you can tack some stitches to hold that in place. If you're working with a regular zipper, not a zipper roll, the front end of your zipper will be a finished edge and no need to worry about that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and flip the zipper so that it's right sides together with the fabric, and again that edge will be tacked down. If you're working with a regular zipper, the front end of your zipper will hit that 1/2 inch marking, and if you're working with the zipper roll, the pointed edge of the zipper tape will hit that 1/2 inch marking. Okay, so go ahead and pin the zipper in place. Again, the zipper will be right sides together with the fabric. Top edges will be aligned. We'll be sewing this pinned edge using 1/4 inch seam allowance. However, we will start sewing at that 1/2 inch marking and stop sewing at the 1/2 inch marking on the other side. Okay, I'm going to stop with the needle down, lift the presser foot up, move my zipper head out of the way, and then finish sewing the rest of the tape down. Okay, now let's add a second zipper panel piece. So I'm going to flip that so that the right side of the fabric is against the wrong side of the zipper. You want to make sure that the short ends of the fabric are aligned. And go ahead and pin that top edge in place. Okay, we're going to be sewing this edge also using 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure to start and stop a 1/2 inch away from either end. Or if you prefer, you can sew from the wrong side of the first zipper panel and just sew directly on top of the previous stitches. Okay, now let's press the fabric so that they're wrong sides together. Okay, so to finish the 3 raw edges of the zipper panel, we're going to be pressing toward the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to just go ahead and open out the fabrics, and I'm going to take my ruler and draw a line that's 1/4 of an inch in from the long edge and both of the short edges. Okay, so I'm going to press at that line toward the wrong side. And then same thing for the short edges. Okay, so I'm going to use my fingers and just bring the lower zipper panel to meet the top one so that the edges are aligned, and I'm going to start pinning. Okay, and then when you get to those short edges, again, you'll make sure that the top and the bottom zipper panel, the fabrics are aligned. Okay, so we're going to take this over to the sewing machine and sew the entire outer edge of the zipper panel using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, and I'm going to increase my stitch length to 3 millimeters for this top stitching. Okay, now we're going to add a third zipper panel piece, and again we'll start off by making those markings that are each 1/2 inch in from the side edges. Okay, so I'm going to flip this zipper so that it's face down, right side against the fabric. And just as before, the front end of the zipper or the pointed end, if you use the zipper roll, will be at that 1/2 inch marking, and then you can go ahead and pin the rest of the way. Okay, again, we're going to be sewing the pinned edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And make sure that you start and stop sewing at those 1/2 inch markings. Okay, now we're going to add the remaining zipper panel piece. The right side of the fabric is going to go against the wrong side of the zipper, and you want to make sure that the short ends are aligned. Okay, so again, you're going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, starting and stopping a 1/2 inch away from either end, or if you prefer, you can flip to the wrong side of the 3rd zipper panel and sew directly on top of the previous stitches. Okay, just as before, we're going to press the fabric's wrong sides together. Okay, so I'm going to mark on the wrong side of one of the zipper panels, the one that's on the top, a 1/4 inch away from the long edge. And this time I'm just going to mark on the long edge because I'm going to use the first pair of zipper panels for eyeing up the pressing of the short ends. So go ahead and press the zipper panel toward the wrong side at the line. And then I'm going to go ahead and finger press that remaining zipper panel and pin in place. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start with this short end. Let's zip that zipper up. I'm going to go ahead and finger press the top edge of this zipper panel so that it looks aligned with the other half. Okay, so go ahead and pin that in place and we'll do the same thing on the opposite end. All right, so just as before, we're going to take this over to the sewing machine and sew the entire outer edge using an 1/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, and I'm going to lengthen my stitch length to 3 millimeters for this top stitching. Okay, now go ahead and take out your zipper tab piece and flip so that the wrong side of the fabric is face up. I'm going to take my ruler and draw a line that's 1/4 of an inch in from both of the long edges. Okay, go ahead and press the fabric toward the wrong side at those lines. Okay, now go ahead and press the fabric in half so that both of the short ends meet. Open out the fabric and then press the bottom short edge in toward the center crease and press. Do the same thing with the other short end, again bringing it in toward the center crease. And then refold so that all of the raw edges will be aligned. Okay, I'm going to give that one last press. And then we're going to take the tail end of the zipper and slide it in so that it hits the center crease, and then refold the fabric. So I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and sew the entire outer edge using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, now go ahead and take out your lining and flip the fabric so that it's right side facing out. Okay, so go ahead and flatten the panels out, making sure that your side seams are aligned. So I'm just going to temporarily place a wonder clip on either side just to hold those seams aligned for the marking. Okay, so go ahead and pull out a ruler. I'm going to draw a horizontal line that's 1.5 inches down from this center curve. And you want to just do a visual check at the side edges to make sure that the ruler hits in the same place. So go ahead and take a marking tool and draw a horizontal line straight across. And we're going to do the same thing for the other side as well. Okay, go ahead and pull out the completed zipper panel. I'm going to flip the panel so that the zipper is face down. And this bottom edge of the zipper panel will go right at the line that we just drew. And you also want to take your ruler and measure in from the side edges to make sure that it's centered. Okay, so let's get this over to the sewing machine. We're going to be sewing this bottom edge of the zipper panel using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Although we're only sewing over this layer of the lining, we're not sewing through the bottom layer or the other half of the bag at all. And also be sure not to sew over your handle pieces. Okay, so again, we're only sewing through the zipper panel and the one layer of the lining, and I have the opening of the bag underneath my sewing machine, so we're not sewing over the back of the bag at all. Okay, so this is what it looks like so far. Now let's go ahead and flip the lining so that it's wrong side facing out. Okay, so we're going to use the line that was drawn on the opposite side of the lining, this line right here. I find it helpful to have the zipper zipped for just a second and kind of do a visual check and just make sure, again, that the seams are aligned and that the zipper is starting and stopping at the same place on the line. So as the bag is flat, this seems like a good position, so I'm just going to go ahead and briefly wonder clip that in place. Same thing on the opposite end, just so I kind of have a better idea where that zipper is going to be starting. Okay. All right, so I found it easiest to unzip the zipper to sew it in place. We're going to be sewing again with the zipper panel face down against the fabric, so right sides together. We're going to be sewing 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric, just like we did before, except this time when we get it on the sewing machine, the wrong side of this panel will be against the bed of your sewing machine, so you can easily get to sewing that seam. Okay, again, make sure that the handles are pushed out of the way so that you don't accidentally sew over them. Okay, leave that handbag zipper unzipped and also unzip the 2 zipper pockets. Okay, pull out your exterior and we're going to turn it so that it's right side facing out. Okay, so we're going to place the lining over the exterior. And while doing so, make sure that that zipper panel is pushed down inside and between the 2 layers out of the way. Okay, so let's start by pinning the fabrics right sides together, starting with the seams. So go ahead and just use your fingers to push those seams open and pin those seams right sides together. We're going to work through and pin all 4 seams. Okay, so let's work our way pinning around the rest of the bag, and again, make sure that zipper panel is pushed down out of the way. So I'm going to start by pinning the side panels. Okay, let's pin the opposite side panel. Again, I'm just using my fingers to push that zipper panel down. And then let's pin the rest of the way around. Okay, so you're going to go ahead and pin your way around the rest of the bag. We're going to be sewing the pinned edge using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. We are not going to sew this short end of any of the handle pieces at all. And one more thing that we need to leave unsewn, the outside portion of all of the handle pieces, we need to leave about 2 inches unsewn. So I'm going to go ahead and use my marking tool and mark where that 2 inches is. So when we start sewing, we're going to actually start sewing here. We're going to leave this unopened, and the same case goes for all 4 of the handle pairs. The outer edge of each pair will be left unsewn by about 2 inches. All right, let's get this over to the sewing machine. Okay, make sure your stitch length is turned back to your usual stitch length, and mine is 2.5 millimeters. And again, we're going to start about 2.5 inches down at that marking that I made. And this is a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so leave your lining wrong side facing out. Pull just the bottom edge of the exterior through up toward the handles so that the bottom portion of the exterior is also wrong side facing out, just like that. Okay, so we're going to start attaching the exterior bottom panel first. Okay, so we're going to place the fabrics right sides together. I'm starting with the short end of the side panel and the bottom panel. The reason we did not sew all the way to the bottom when we started attaching the exterior is so that these bottom edges could lay separated. Okay, so I'm going to take my exterior bottom panel, spread that corner out, and make sure that the corners are aligned. Okay, same thing on the opposite short end. Again, split the corners apart and place your fabric so that they're right sides together, corners aligned. And then we'll be pinning both of the long edges in the same manner. So start by pinning both of the corners. And then I'm going to actually walk my fingers out toward the center so that I can pin the center and then pin my way outward. Okay, so we're going to be sewing the pinned edges using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, except I'm going to be sewing one edge at a time. And you'll want to sew with the bottom panel against the bed of your sewing machine. So an easy way to know where you're going to start sewing, it's going to be a 1/4 inch in. You have the stitching line from where you attach the side panels to the front and the back of the bag, so that's where you'll start sewing, at that stitching line. You'll stop sewing at the opposite end where you can see the stitching line. So again, 1/4 inch seam allowance, you're going to start and stop a 1/4 inch away from each end. Take this off the machine, set it up for the long edge. Same thing as before, you're going to start sewing a 1/4 inch in, stop sewing a 1/4 inch away from this edge, so basically where the stitching line is. And you'll do the same thing for all 4 edges. You'll sew all 4 edges individually. Okay, we're going to repeat the same process with the lining, except you'll want to make sure to push those zipper pockets out of the way. Go ahead and grab your lining bottom panel and we'll pin it in place the exact same way as we did with the exterior. Okay, the process is going to be the same as what we did with the exterior. You're going to use 1/4 inch seam allowance, sewing one edge at a time for a total of 4 edges, and you'll start and stop 1/4 inch away from each end. And again, please make sure your handles and your zipper pockets are out of your way so that you don't accidentally sew over them. Okay, now we're going to pull the bag right side out through the opening in the zipper pocket. So go ahead and find your zipper pocket where you left that opening and reach in and gently pull your bag through the opening until the bottom portion, the main portion of the bag, is pulled right side out. Okay, so I'm just going to use my fingers just to push out the bottoms of the bag. We'll iron the bag a bit before we do our top stitching and when the bag's fully finished. Okay, so now we need to pull the handles right side out. And you have a few options for doing that. There's a few different turning tools which I found to be helpful. A turning tool like this with a little hook on one end, a tube turner with a wooden dowel, or a hemostat. And I found the hemostat to be the most helpful as far as turning these types of handles right side out. Okay, so I pulled 3 of my handles right side facing out, and I left one so that I could show you in this video how I did it with the hemostat. And like I said, several different tools will do the trick as well. So I tried a few different methods with the hemostat. I tried to reach in with the very end of the hemostat and grab this end of the handle and tried to pull it through. The problem is there's just too much fabric and interfacing to pull the whole entire thing through at once. And so what I did is I just pulled it through little by little. Okay, so here's the base of the handle, and so I just reached the hemostat through. Let me just show you on the fabric how it grabs onto the fabric. So you just click the handle in place and it holds onto the fabric for you. So I'm just going to go ahead and reach in little by little and then just pull the fabric through. And as you're pulling through, you'll just kind of smooth the opening so that you can get the hemostat through and pull some more fabric through. So just take your time. You're almost finished with the bag, but don't be impatient. This step takes a little bit of time to properly pull everything through, but in about 10 minutes or so, you'll have all 4 of the handles pulled right side out. An alternative, which I've also written in the pattern instructions for step number 25, if you find that you're having a hard time pulling the handles right side out using the turning tool, you can certainly, how you have the side edge unsewn, you can certainly take your seam ripper and unpick a little bit. I would probably say up to here for ease of pulling it right side out. We'll be top stitching the bag later, so if you do decide to unpick a little bit of your handles, they will be sewn down. When we go to do the final top stitching, you'll just finger press the fabrics wrong sides together as they look here, and then the top stitching will catch your edges so that no raw edges are enclosed. But I feel pretty good about using the hemostat. It's pretty easy to use and it doesn't damage your fabric at all. How I first heard about using hemostat for turning things right side out is I have a few patterns for various plush or stuffies, stuffed animals. And oftentimes the hemostat is used for turning little pieces like ears and little hands of, say, like a teddy bear right side out, because those pieces are generally on the small side. Okay, so now we're going to finish off the handles. So I'm going to grab the handle from the front of the bag and I'm going to go ahead and fold out the fabrics. That's why we left that top two edges unsewn. Making sure your handle is not twisted and your exterior fabric will be facing your exterior fabric, and same thing with the lining. I'm going to finger press those seams so that they're on opposing sides. So that means this seam will be facing toward the right. This seam will be facing toward the left, just so the seams are sort of nested. That not only makes it easier to sew to line up the seams, but it sort of reduces the bulk a little bit. So I'm going to pin those right sides together. And then the same thing on the back of the bag. Again, I'm just going to go ahead and bring those handle pieces so that they're right sides together. So again, my exterior fabrics will be facing. And I'm going to nest the seams. So again, one seam will go toward the right and one seam toward the left. Okay, we're going to be sewing both of these pinned edges using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and we'll be sewing from one end to the other. Okay, now we're going to grade those handle seams. So grading the seams basically means that 1/2 of the seam will be left alone, so this top edge I'm going to leave uncut. The bottom half of the seam we're just going to trim to about in half. And what that does, grading of the seam, helps the fabrics lie a bit more flat or a bit more thin in that seam area, because they're kind of alternating levels. Okay, so go ahead and flip those fabrics so that they're wrong sides together. By the way, you'll do the same thing with the other handle as far as grading the seam. And I'm first going to start at this area where we left the opening in the handle. So I'm just going to go ahead and finger press the fabrics toward the wrong side, both exterior and lining, and pin the layers together. And if you prefer, you can finger press and then iron it first. Okay, you'll do the same thing with the other handle. That encloses all the raw edges. And then before top stitching, I'm just going to take wonder clips and work my way around the bag. I find that having the wonder clips to hold the edges before top stitching just makes it easier, and also easier to make sure you can use your fingers to roll out the seams so that the fabrics are wrong sides together. Okay, so go ahead and continue working your way around the rest of the bag and putting wonder clips basically everywhere. We're going to take this over to the sewing machine and we're going to top stitch the entire outer edge of the bag. And I'm going to lengthen my stitch length for this top stitching, so I'm going to lengthen to 3 millimeters. Okay, we're going to be using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance here, and I also wanted to mention, just in case your lining fabric doesn't exactly match your exterior fabric, feel free to have your bobbin thread match your lining fabric and your top thread match your exterior. That way your top stitching will blend in and look really nice. And also make sure that zipper panel is pushed down and out of your way to make sure that you're not sewing over the zipper panel when you're completing the top stitching. Okay, and continue working your way around the rest of the bag, the inner and outer edges of both handles. Okay, now we just need to close up the opening in the zipper pocket. So go ahead and find the zipper pocket where you left the opening and go ahead and pull that opening out. Poke out your corners. And then I'm just going to go ahead and finger press the fabrics toward the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch. If you feel more comfortable, you could certainly measure this out and mark it with your marking tool instead. Okay, so there's 2 ways to close the opening in the lining. You can either slip stitch the opening closed by hand, And I have a video on my YouTube channel on how to slip stitch an opening closed. Or you can just go ahead and top stitch the opening using an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So since this is in the inside of the zipper pocket, I'm just going to go ahead and top stitch the opening closed using an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so the last thing that's left is to give your bag a good press. So you want to make sure that you press your handles really nicely. Press the exterior and the lining side of the handles. And you also want to give the bag a good press, kind of to give it a defined shape. So you can either pinch your, say this is the bottom seam, pinch the bottom seam, lay it against your ironing board and iron it. If you're using cork, vinyl, or leather, you may consider using wonder clips to hold or press the edges instead. So if you're going that route, you'll just go ahead and roll those seams outward to press them. And same thing with the sides. Basically, you'll work your way all the way around the perimeter of the bag. So just let those wonder clips sit for a couple hours and then you can take them off. And of course the other option is to just iron. All right, so give your bag a good press. I promise it will be worth the extra effort, and then your bag's all finished. Thanks so much for sewing along with me. I can't wait to see your finished bag. Be sure to post a photo of your finished project in my Facebook group. And remember, if I can do it, so can you.